Hello, this is a tournament run where I try to make the crazy, wacky ideas from my viewers work. And here's one idea absolutely working. I got Zaytan with a net and a caster with Flames of Asgore. Now, you may know that it already does a lot of damage to infantry, but if you cast it directly beneath a single entity, it will spawn all the projectiles on top of them and do massive damage. So game number 1 of this tournament is already looking pretty good, though it doesn't mean that it's completely over just yet. You see, Zaytan is quite expensive, and that giant squig does in fact rally, which means we're gonna have to fight it. Unfortunately for me, my opponent does have fermented fungi, so it's gonna be a little bit sketch. However, I do manage to escape without getting too much damage on my lords. Much more troublesome, however, are the cavalry summons that my opponent is bringing in, because I kind of spent all my magic trying to kill that squig. My hobgoblin cavalry does get annihilated by the superior greenskin cavalry, and my single entities are caught. Thankfully, I am able to cast another spell of Flames of Asgore, and we do manage to rout off the squigs again. And now, without any squigs to spare, I'm able to chase down my opponent's lord, and now it's just a race to capture the points before we completely lose the game. You see, my opponent already has over 1,000 victory tickets, and he's still gaining one per second for each point he controls. And with 1,500 tickets being the win condition of this game mode, I'm going to need to triple cap my opponent to win this. It's a pretty tough fight, and my opponent does manage to rout off Zaytan along with my caster using his skirmishers, but my terror-causing train does stick around due to it being unbreakable, and we are able to slowly shove him off the point. Most of my mobility, however, is not very strong against his cavalry, but my Kadai Fireborn eventually do make it to the point, and we're able to secure a pretty solid victory. This almost entirely revolves around my caster doing well though, because if you look at the top left trading values, we both did about the same damage to each other. And this is after my caster got 5,000 gold worth of value in just one battle. So in game number 2, we're now trying to get a win against the forces of Nurgle. If I can get enough victories, we'll qualify for the semifinals, so hopefully this one goes well. They do have the Regiment of Renowned Noxbringer, which does reduce the ammo of my skirmishers if it can land a hit, but as long as I change my direction as soon as it shoots, it's not going to be getting too much value. What instead is going to be much more problematic for me are the Angels of Decay. Flames of Asgore does not hit flying units, and these guys are absolute beasts in melee combat. You wouldn't think it because they have a ranged attack, but they're super good at killing flying single entities like Zaytan. This leads to a complete loss of air superiority, which means we are now falling pretty badly behind. The Dreadquake mortar that I summoned in is not doing too great either, simply because it doesn't seem to target center mass on units when it fires, so we're gonna have to try and come back. I moved the Dreadquake mortar even closer to my opponent's army so he can't dodge it, but it just keeps firing at the edge of formations. And without the Dreadquake getting a lot of value and no good ground targets to cast Flames of Asgore on, we're essentially dead here. These are the Swiss qualifier games though, so as long as I win my next 2 games, we should make it to the semifinals. So for game number 3, I decided to go for a Dwarven viewer suggestion. This is going to be trying to make the Royal Dowie Air Force work, and while it is pretty good, it definitely has a lot of weaknesses. Air units can't capture points, and my opponent's playing Nurgle, which means we essentially have a DPS race to kill all of his army units before he reaches 1,500 tickets. Thankfully for me though, he decided to send in a single unit of Furies at the beginning, and while they're good at dealing with one gyrocopter, they don't really do too well against double gyro bomber, a gyrocopter, and a thunder barge. Along with the Grim Delvers just melting them from the ground, they get deleted almost instantly, which means I can now drop bombs on his unsuspecting infantry. More Furies do get summoned in though, but we're ready for this. I have 3 units of Rangers at the ready to support my gyrocopters, and because they have stealth, my opponent is completely unprepared when they get a massive volley on his Furies. We're still going to have to clean up his infantry very quickly though, because my opponent still has all 3 capture points, and there's quite a bit of infantry left. I do manage to secure the first point, and even though I have a pretty nice value lead, this is not a very comfortable position. I have 7.5 minutes to capture these next 2 points, but with a little bit of micro and a lot of bombs, we are able to begin clearing before my infantry show up to capture. This way, we clear the path forwards for my infantry to get to the capture points as fast as humanly possible. Things are certainly looking really good, especially after the Thunder Barge jams a javelin into the opponent's lord, but my opponent does have one last trick up his sleeve, because he's been hiding a ton of infantry in the trees, and this means our capturing is going to be stalled by quite a bit. He's also been saving a lot of money too, which means a ton of Furies now and a giant wave gets summoned on in, and this is where the build is going to be facing a little bit of hardship. With each Fury on 1 gyrocopter each, I can't get good focus fire on them to get them to crumbling. And then by pushing in with all of his infantry at once, while my rangers are shooting at his Furies, I can't really do much to his infantry. But thankfully, none of his infantry is that elite. I drop off the rest of my bombs on my gyrocopters before the Furies manage to catch them, and using Doomseekers, we begin clearing out his infantry. And man, am I glad for Doomseekers here. They were added in the last Dwarf DLC, and they filled a hole in the roster so perfectly, cause everything that counters this Dowie Air Force gets obliterated by Doomseekers. My opponent really needs some elite infantry to deal with the Doomseekers, but with the Dowie Air Force still in the skies, that is definitely a risky endeavor. So instead, they spam as many cheap units as possible to hold the points, but this is simply not going to be enough. My army has uptraded far too well in this game, and that means we're on our way to tabling our opponent and ensuring that he has no units left on the battlefield. It doesn't matter how high his victory tickets are, with my Dowie Air Force killing any units that spawn onto the battlefield, there is no way he can capture any points, so he taps out and we take the win. So all I gotta do now to make it to the semifinals is win this next match with the pretty memey build. My viewers really wanted to see me win with a Slayers only dwarf build. And in case you didn't know, Slayers are a dwarf unit type that have unbreakable, but also completely no armor. This would usually be a terrible composition in many matchups, but because dwarves usually have a lot of armor, my opponent decided to bring a whack load of armor-piercing units. And with my opponent also fielding the Noxbringer, which is primarily used against slow-moving Dwarven ranged infantry, I've essentially accidentally myself into a hard counterpick build against this Nurgle army. There's really not much to do except send my Slayers to their doom and watch them chop away. Doomseekers are going to be especially useful here because they have magic attacks, and Epidemius is trying to farm as much physical resist as possible. And for the odd horseman that gets summoned in, I do have Slayer Pirates, which are my only range unit. I eventually manage to grind down their infantry, and then my Demon Slayer Lord, true to his name, gets sent on the Noxbringer. He manages to take it down, and just like in lore, he barely survives with 55 HP left. Although, interesting thing about running a Slayer only army, if he did manage to die, the only downside is that my army would get a leadership wide debuff, and that doesn't really matter if everything's unbreakable. Probably one of the most fun games I had in this tournament, because I really did not expect it to work at all. But I guess that's kind of what happens when you bring something that your opponent completely does not expect. And with that win, we're now up against the Skaven as the Chaos Dwarves. Now, they're not especially good right now in terms of win rate, but they definitely have teeth. My opponents brought a little bit of a skirmish build with some Regiment of Renowned Stealth Jezzails in his backline. You can't see them, but you can see their purple tracer bullets. And we're going to need to take them out, because if I don't, they're just gonna keep poking away at my army, and if I'm forced to engage on my opponent all the way in his backfield, we're probably gonna lose. However, while fighting in my opponent's backline, he does make a little bit of a blunder, and his Jezzails march straight forward into my skirmishers. And this is probably gonna cost my opponent the game if I don't make any misplays. We did talk a bit after the game, and that's when I learned he had a fatal misconception about what guard mode does. A lot of people believe that it stops your range units from moving, but in reality, it just stops them from chasing units. So if they don't have line of sight and you right click a target, they're going to march forwards until they get that line of sight. And on this particular map with a hill in the middle, it really only took one right click for those Jezzails to march straight to their deaths. Unfortunately, there's no way to prevent this anytime you give an attack command, so you're just gonna have to babysit your units. I have asked CA to fix this issue at least, so hopefully one day we get a guard mode that keeps units in place. But anyways, back to the game. Without my opponent's Jezzails sniping my cavalry as they skirmish around, I have almost free reign over his slower army. Skaven infantry is generally pretty fast, but not as fast as cavalry. With a bunch of flanks, the leadership does not hold, and we are able to win the semifinals. This means I just have to win one more match against the Dark Elves to say that we won with purely viewer submitted meme ideas. And boy am I excited, because my opponent has brought Rakarth, and on his chariot, he should be a big enough target to one-shot with my Flames of Asgore spell. So I use my artillery to get a little bit of early game trading, hoping it'll be enough to goad Rakarth into net range. My Deathstreak rocket launcher is annihilating his range backline, I catch his sorcerer, and with so many capture points early on, I have so much time to just focus on trading. Things are looking really good right now, and Rakarth even pushes forwards for me to make the massive play. I get the net directly on top of him, get the Flames of Asgore, cast dead center on his unit model, but then disaster strikes. It completely misses Rakarth, only doing half damage to him after the missiles land, but that was definitely a strange amount of damage. And with the Dark Elf passive triggered, things are looking really bad. There's a lot of units that are on the brink of routing, but because Rakarth lived, their leadership is still staying strong enough to stick around. This then leads to almost a complete army loss and a devastating knockout in the final round of the tournament. So let's see exactly what went wrong here. As soon as I netted Rakarth, I cast a spell directly underneath them, but you may notice it's actually between his horses and the chariot, so it completely misses his hitbox. So for a bit of closure, this is what would have happened if I cast on the back end of Rakarth's chariot. Unfortunately, it was not the build that failed me. It was indeed the knowledge gap, simply because I never really tried this strategy before. You can see it brings them from 100% HP to essentially 0, and I'm pretty sure this would have won us the tournament. But at least we can rest easy now, knowing that viewer submitted ideas, memes or not, they can absolutely win.